Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Milliken. I'm a Security Engineering Manager here at Google. Very briefly, I will introduce our guest this afternoon. He's a blogger. Most of you know him from Schneier.com. He's an author of many works, including Liars and Outliers, which he'll be talking about today. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bruce Schneier.
If you put that near me, there's feedback and it's all bad. So hi, thanks. I'm actually not going to talk about my book because I figure if you want to hear about it, you can read it. I'd rather talk about stuff that I've been thinking about since that. This is very much ideas in progress, which I think makes it good for a talk here. So I'm always interested in feedback and comments, and there'll be time for that. What I want to talk about is security and power, because I think that is a lot of what's interesting in right now and going on right now. So basically, technologies are disruptive, right? They disrupt society by disrupting power balances. And you can look at the history of, I don't know, the plow or the stirrup or gunpowder, the printing press, telegraph, radio, airplane, I don't know, container shipping, drought-resistant wheat, and see how those technologies changed the balance of power. And then there's a lot written about this, written as history. Right? Harder is doing this in the present, which is really what I'm thinking about on the internet. Right? I mean, the internet is incredibly disruptive. We've seen entire industries disappear. We've seen entire industries created. We've seen industries upended. We've seen the computer industry itself upended several times. Government has changed a lot. We see governments losing power as citizens organize. We're seeing political movements become easier. We're seeing totalitarian states use power. I mean, really, the Obama campaign was revolutionary in how they use the internet to organize and engage people. You could look at how technology has changed the media, ranging from the 24-hour news cycle to bloggers and citizen journalism and two-way communications and the huge explosion of media sources, social power. I mean, there's a lot here, right? Personal publishing, the internet, email, right? Criminal power. It's certain crimes becoming easier, identity theft, which is really impersonation fraud done to scale, and how the internet has changed things. And I think about how this affects computer security, which is basically what I do, and then again, how that affects the rest of the world. So traditionally, computer security has had the model of the user takes care of it. Right? That's been the traditional model. It's actually a very strange model, right? That we are selling products that aren't secure, aren't any good, and expect the user to make them good. I think of it as an automobile manufacturer when they sell you a car saying, that car doesn't come with brakes. But brakes are really important, and we think you should have them. There's some good aftermarket dealers, but you should get some brakes installed pretty quickly, maybe on the drive home. Right? It's a much safer car that way. In a lot of ways, that's what we would do with antivirus, with firewalls. We would sell these products and expect the user to do it themselves, right? To have some level of expertise necessary to secure their environment. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why we did this. It's the speed of our industry. It's how the youth of our industry. But it was the norm. Right, that model is breaking. Right, that model is less becoming the norm. It's changing, actually, not because we've realized there are better ways to do security, but because of how computers and the net are working today. Right, there are two trends that I think push change this model. The first is cloud computing. Now, on the one hand, cloud computing isn't anything new. Right? In the 60s, we called it time sharing. In the 80s, we called it client server. In the 90s, I had a company, we called it managed security or managed services. Right? It's fundamentally a balance between the cost of computation and the cost of data transport. Right? In the 60s, computation is very expensive, so it makes sense to centralize computers in their own rooms, their own air conditioning, and give people badges. In the 80s, what becomes expensive is large storage, so you end up with a client-server model. Right? In the 90s, it's more services. Right now, the cost of computing is really dropping towards free. The cost of transport is dropping towards free. So it makes sense economically is to put your computers on the places on the planet where they can be run the most cheaply and access them from wherever you are. Right? That seems to be the end game. Right? There's nothing cheaper than free. Right? I mean, the times where you see computation pushed to the edges are places where you have relatively low bandwidth, right? Maybe mobile applications, or relatively high need for local computation, like gaming. Right? But even those are becoming more of a cloud model. So that's the first trend. The second trend is lockdown endpoints. And I think this is more of a trend in business than in technology. But nowadays, the computing platforms we buy, we have much less control over. Right? So I have an iPhone. I can't clear my cookies on an iPhone. Right? I can't get a program that does that. I can't even get a program that erases files because I don't have direct control over the memory map. There's weird things going on in your system.
I'm trying to deal with it.
Wow. She's solving on her laptop. Okay, all right, go.
You want to borrow this?
So yesterday, right?
Right, so these end user devices, whether they're tablets or phones or Kindles, the user has much less control over. Right, on a Kindle, updates are downloaded automatically, and I can even say yes. At least on the iPhone, I can say yes or no. Right, but I still don't have anywhere near the control I have on my OSs. OSs are moving that direction as well. Right, both Windows 8 and Mountain Lion are moving to the direction of these mobile platforms to give the user less control. And I think this is just purely economics. The companies have realized that the more they can control the supply chain, the better they'll do. So whether it's Apple with their Apple Store, and however the system works, you're just better off if you can control as much of the environment as possible. So this brings us to a new model of security. And the model is someone else takes care of it. Right? The model is it just happens automatically by magic. Right? This happens on my Gmail account. Right? I have no control over Gmail security. I have to simply trust that Google does it. I have no control over my pictures on Flickr or my Facebook account, any of that stuff. And I have less and less control over the devices where I view these things. Right, so users have to trust vendors. To a degree we hadn't before. And there's a lot of good reasons why we do this. I mean, all the reasons why these models make sense. Convenience, redundancy, automation, the ability to share things. And the trust can be surprisingly complete. We're living in a world where Facebook mediates all of our friend interactions. I mean, already Google knows more about my interests than my wife does, which is a little bit freaky. Google knows what kind of porn every American likes, which is really freaky. Right? But it's a trade-off, right? It's a trade-off we actually do pretty willingly. We give up some control in exchange for the environment that works well for us, and we trust that the vendors will treat us well and protect us from harm. Right? On the other hand, we're running out of other options. Right? For most everybody, there aren't any real viable alternatives. I mean, I run Eudora, but I'm increasingly a freak. My mother has a way better time on her computer since she got an Apple and has Apple handling every part of her computing environment. Right? She loses a phone, she gets a new one, it just works great. And most of us can't do it ourselves. Right? This is becoming more and more complex. I mean, I can't offer advice to tell people to run their own mail servers. And that didn't make sense 20 years ago. It really doesn't make sense now. And you can't run your own Facebook. So the model I think of when I think of this type of computing environment is feudal security. And that's feudal with a D and not with a T. Right? It's that we as users have to pledge our allegiance to some powerful company who in turn promises to protect us. And I like it as a metaphor, both because there's a real rich historical metaphor, because everyone's watching Game of Thrones. Right? So you can pull from both sources. Right? And if you go back to classic medieval feudalism, it was a system designed for a dangerous environment where you needed someone more powerful than you to protect you. Right? It was a series of hierarchical relationships. There were obligations in both directions. It was actually a pretty complex political system. And I see more of it permeating the environment that we work in today. Right? It has its advantages. Right? For most people, the cloud providers are better at security than they are. Right? Automatic cloud backup is fantastic. Automatic updates is fantastic. All of these things are good. Right? So feudal security provides this level of security that most everybody is below. So it'll raise them up to whatever level the providers are providing. Right? For those up here, it lowers them down. And where you see the barriers to people adopting this are things like the banks, who naturally have a higher level of security and don't want to go down. I assume that at some point we are going to see a business model of a high security cloud vendor, right? Whether it's a Dropbox or whatever, or an email service, just something for some of these more high assurance users. Right? We also have the problem of regulation. For a lot of companies, they have auditing and reporting requirements. And if you go to, you go to Dropbox and say, we're using you for our company, we need to audit your system. They will say, go away. Or to Rackspace. And I assume we're going to see some water flow auditing model where, the Rackspace audit flows down to whatever service works on top of that, which flows down to whatever company now uses that service. Because I think we have to solve the regulatory barriers here. Right? Feudal security has risks. The vendors are going to act in their self-interest. You hope that their self-interest dovetails with your self-interest, but that's not always the case. It's much less the case when you're not paying for the service, when in fact you are a user, not a customer. As we see, vendors will make side deals with the government. Right? And the legal regime is different. If the data is in your premises, then it's in their premises. Right? Vendors can act arbitrarily. Vendors can make mistakes. And vendors have an incentive to keep users tied to themselves. You guys are an exception by allowing users to take their data and leave. Right? Most companies don't do that. Because tying the data to the company increases lock-in, increases the value of the company. Right? So this model is inherently based on trust. Right? It's inherently based on the companies, the feudal lords, convincing the users to trust them with their data, their photos, their friends, with everything. And unfortunately, the business model for a lot of these companies is basically betraying that trust for profit. Right? And that is, depending on which company, more or less transparent, right? More or less salient. A lot of effort does go into hiding that fact, to pretending it's not true. Right? And as we turned out, these companies have a side business betraying the trust of the government too. So there's a little bit, or in some cases a lot, of deceit that this is all based on. And I do worry about how long that can sustain. Some of it seems to be able to be sustained indefinitely. For others, I'm not so sure. The feudal model is also inherently based on power. And that's what I'm thinking is interesting right now. Right? And it does dovetail very nicely with the current alignment of power on the internet. Right? The rise of the controlled endpoints and the third party holding your data. Those two different poles. So I started the talk by mentioning about the internet changing power. And if you look back at the history of the internet, a lot of us thought that it would flow in a certain direction. Right? The internet was designed. The internet was really designed in the way that made most technical sense. There wasn't a lot of agenda placed on the net as was first designed. And if you look back at the literature around that time, you read about the natural laws of the internet. Right? That the internet works a certain way because it's like gravity. It's just the way it has to work. It's the way it makes sense. And a lot of us thought this was inevitable. This was the way the world had to work. I have two quotes. One is John Perry Barlow in 1996. He's addressing the World Economic Forum. And he has something called the Declaration of Independence in Cyberspace, which is a great document to read. And he's telling governments things like, you have no moral right to rule us, nor do you possess any methods of enforcement we have reason to fear. Now, 3 years earlier, John Gilmore writes that the internet interprets censorship as damage and routes around it. Now, these are very utopian quotes, but we all believed them back then. Right? We believed that is how the internet works, that the internet takes the masses, makes them powerful, takes the governments, and makes them powerless. It turns out that's just not true. Right? That's not the way it works. What the internet does, like many technologies, is magnify power. Right? It magnifies power in general. And what happened is when the powerless discovered the internet, suddenly they had power. Right? The hackers, the dissidents, the criminals, the disenfranchised. As those marginal groups discovered the net, suddenly they had power they didn't have before. And the change was fast and it was stark. But when powerful interests realized the potential of the internet, they had more power to magnify. Right? They were much slower, but their ability to use the internet to increase their power is greater. Like the unorganized were more nimble and quick, and the institutions were slower and more effective. And that's where we are today. So I look around and I see 4 classes of internet tools of power. And what's interesting about them is they all are tools by which a totalitarian government can increase their power, but they all have viable market reasons for existing. Right? So censorship is also content filtering or data loss prevention. Right? Propaganda is marketing. Surveillance is surveillance. I guess personal data collection. Surveillance is the business model of the internet. Right? Use control. Right? In China, programs have to be certified by the government in order to be used on computers there, which sounds an awful lot like the Apple Store. Right? I mean, we laugh, but this is important. Right? We're building tools that have very different sorts of uses depending on who's using them and why. And in both the government and the corporate sphere, powerful interests are gaining power with these tools. Right? Censorship and surveillance are both on the rise. The Internet Censorship Project, which tracks censorship around the world, finds more of it every year. We see more surveillance by governments every year. I mean, even before the United States stuff that happened 2 weeks ago. Right? More personal data is being collected and correlated. More control over hardware and software. Right? Less purchasing, more licensing. We saw Adobe move to that model. Right? This is getting harder. I'm trying to find a task list productivity tool, and I can't find a good one that doesn't require me to use the cloud. Right? And we have corporations. I mean, I think Facebook is an example. They're actually changing social norms. Right? They are affecting what people think is normal, is regular. And in a for-profit motive. Right? I think propaganda is something we don't talk about a lot, but it's both in companies and governments. I mean, we might call it viral marketing, or there's some cute names for it, but basically it's propaganda. And we're seeing more and more of it. And now we're at the point where power basically controls everyone's data. Because in a lot of ways, personal data equals power, both on the government side and the corporate side. Even in non-internet businesses, the need to own the relationship, to know more about the customer, is driving a lot of data collection and all that back-end correlation. And I worry a lot about the commingling of corporate and government interests here. Right? We live in a world, and I don't have to go through the details, of ubiquitous surveillance. That basically everything is collected. I mean, Charlie Stross has written about this as the end of prehistory. That sometime in our lifetime we're going to switch from prehistory, where only some things were saved, to actual history where everything is saved. Now we're in a world where most everything is saved. And what's happening now, and I think it's something I'm not happy about, but to try to understand, is how powerful interests are trying to steer this. But I mentioned Facebook changing social norms, but we're seeing industries lobbying for laws to make their business models more profitable. So that's laws to prevent digital copying, laws to reduce privacy, laws allowing different businesses to control bandwidth. And on the government side, we're seeing international bodies trying to get rulings to make the internet easier to surveil and to censor. Right? I've heard this called cyber nationalism. And last, I think November, in Dubai, there was a meeting of the ITU. That's the International Telecommunications Union. Those are the guys that run the phone system. They're not really very tech savvy, but they are very international. They are very non-US centric. And they want to wrest control of the internet from the US. For a lot of reasons, I think this would be a disaster. But there's a strong push. And unfortunately, I wrote about this on my blog today, I think all the Snowden documents makes their case a lot easier. Because now when they say, well, you can't trust the Americans, everyone say, oh yeah, you're right, you can't trust the Americans. So, I mean, so these things are happening now. We're seeing a large rise in the increase of militarization of cyberspace, which will push more of the internet under government control. I mean, I very much believe we are in the middle of a cyber war arms race. No, it's just heated up a little bit in the past couple of weeks, because we've been complaining about China for the past few years. I've always assumed we've been giving as good as we're getting, and now we're getting data that we are giving as good as we're getting, which is just going to make things worse. Right, we're pretty sure that the cyber attack against the Saudi oil company Aramco was launched by Iran as in retaliation for Stuxnet, which sounds complicated, but I don't know geopolitics. Maybe that makes sense. And we're seeing a lot of alignment of corporate and government power. I'm pretty sure I'm quoted in the New York Times today as calling Facebook the NSA's wet dream. I'm surprised I used those words. Well, it was probably a long interview. Right, so I mean, here's a way to think of it. In our country, we have two different types of law. There's constitutional law that regulates what governments do, and there's I guess, regulatory law that constrains what corporations do. And they're kind of separate. We're now living in a world where each group has learned to use the other's law to get around its own restrictions. Right? If the government said, you all have to carry tracking devices 24/7, right, it would just, that would be unconstitutional. They could never get away with it. Yet we all carry cell phones. Right? They all said, you must register whenever you meet a new friend. Right? We never allow it, yet we all go on Facebook. I mean, Facebook, and actually, I played this earlier. 2 years ago, The Onion did a video. Just go to YouTube and type The Onion Facebook CIA. It's a short news video about Facebook, Facebook being the new CIA program. It's hysterical, and it's 2 years old, which makes it kind of sad. Now, on the other hand, we're seeing corporations use the governments to enforce their business models. Right? If, I don't know, the movie industry said that we're going to go into people's computers and trash them if we think they're copying files, that would be wrong. But they're going to try to get a law to do the same thing. Copyright, a lot of examples where industries are trying to bypassing their own problems by going through government. And I think this only gets exacerbated as more technology. Right? Feudal lords get more powerful. And some of that is just the natural order of bigness in our society right now. I mean, the way technology is right now, it favors the big. It doesn't favor many small. It favors 2 or 3 on top and nobody else. And it's true in geopolitics too. Right? Think about it. In any climate change negotiation on the planet, who do you think has more power, Exxon or Bolivia? It's not even close. Who has more power, Exxon or the United States? That's actually a discussion. This is weird. Okay, so that's one trajectory. There's another trajectory. There's a counterbalancing one, right, based on different natural laws of technology. So in the book, I'm not talking about liars and outliers. I discuss something called a security gap. And in that book, I'm talking about effectively the arms race between attackers and defenders. And that technology causes disruptions in that arms race. And then there's a rebalancing. Right? So firearms are invented, fingerprint technology is invented. All those things upset the balance between attackers and defenders. And one of the things I point out is that as technology advances, attackers have a natural advantage. Right? Some of it's a basic first mover advantage. But in general, unorganized attackers can make use of innovations faster. Right? So, I don't know, imagine someone invents the motor car. Right? And the police say, well, that's a really interesting thing. We could use one of those. So they have a group to study the automobile, and they produce an RFP, and they get bids, and they pick an automobile manufacturer, they get a car, they have a training system. Meanwhile, the burglar says, oh, look, new getaway vehicle. Right? And can much more quickly use that. We saw that on the internet. And if you remember, as soon as the internet became a commercial entity, we saw a new breed of cyber criminal appear like organically out of the ground. Right? Immediately able to commit crimes and fraud and identity theft. And all of these new things just showed up. Meanwhile, the police, who were trained on Agatha Christie novels, took, 10 years to figure it out. And they have figured it out, but if you were around during that time, it was really painful, as they had no idea what cybercrime was or how it worked. Right? So there's this delay when a new technology appears. And that's what I think of as a security gap. Right? The delay between when the non-powerful can make use of the new technology, right, the fast and nimble, and between when the powerful, the big and ponderous, can make use of the technology. And that gap gives attackers a natural advantage. And I'll spare you the details, but basically that gap it tends to be greater when there's more technology, right, when your curve is greater. And it's greater in times of rapid technological, actually it's greater in times of rapid social change due to technological change. And today we're living in a world with more technology than ever before, and a greater ramp of social change due to technological change than ever before. So we're seeing an ever-increasing security gap. So this is the big question that I do not have an answer to. Who wins? Who wins, and in what circumstance? Right? Does big, slow power beat small, nimble power? And there's going to be some David and Goliath metaphor, or Robin Hood and Schneier. I mean, I guess I could need a more medieval metaphor, right? But but that seems like an open question that we don't know. So, for example, in Syria recently, we saw the Syrian dissidents use Facebook to organize. We saw the Syrian government use Facebook to arrest dissidents. So right now it's kind of a mess. As this shakes out, who gets the upper hand? I mean, right now it seems like governments do. It seems like the ability to collect, to analyze, to employ police beats dissidents. Right? It seems like the big corporations win. That the need to have a credit card or be on Facebook and to do all these things to live your life are such that you can't shut them off, and they win. But it's not clear to me. I mean, it does seem clear to me that those that want to get around the systems always will be able to. But really I'm now concerned about everyone in the middle. Right? The nimble are here, the powerful are here. Sort of here's the rest of us, which I guess is the hapless peasants. And as the powerful get more control, I think we get largely left out of any negotiations. And you see this in arbitrary rules, arbitrary terms of service. You see this in secret NSA spying programs, or secret overrides to rules, and power aligning with power. Right? It's not clear to me that these actually do catch terrorists. And it's pretty clear to me that they don't actually, but they do affect the rest of us. And I think these power issues are going to affect all of the discussions we have about the future of the internet in the coming decade. Because these are actually complex issues. We have to decide how we balance, personal privacy against law enforcement. How we balance them when we want to prevent copy protection or prevent child pornography. When we decide, is it acceptable for us to be judged by computer algorithms? Is it acceptable to feed us search results, to loan us money for a house, to search us at airports, to convict us from drunk driving? How these algorithms affect us. Right? Do we have the right to correct data about ourselves or to delete it? Do we want computers to forget? There's a lot of social lubricant in our society by the fact that we are forgetting species. Do you really want? I don't want Google Glass because I don't want my wife to be able to pull up old arguments. Right? That seems bad. Right, so there's a lot of power struggles, and there are bigger ones coming. Right? Cory Doctorow writes about the coming battles having to do with 3D printing, and they're very much the same as the copyright battles. Right? There will be powerful interests that want to stop the execution of certain data files. Right? It was music and movies. In the future, it'll be 3D gun. It'll be working guns. It'll be the Nike swoosh. His favorite example is anatomically correct, interchangeable Barbie torsos, which I never thought of, but would freak out Mattel. Probably rightly so. right? Or you know, little statues of Mickey Mouse, which will freak out a very powerful company.
The Mickey Mouse.
Who is that? Right, you know, we see some incredibly destabilizing technologies coming. And this whole debate about weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, biological, is basically the idea is that as technology magnifies power, society can deal with fewer bad events. Right? So if the average bad guy, I'm just going to make this up, can kill 10 people before he's captured, or rob 10 houses before he's captured, we could handle, you know, so many robbers. But if they can now do 100 times as much damage, we now need only 1/100th of them to maintain the same security level. And a lot of our security is based on having some low level of badness. But as power magnifies the amount of badness each individual can do, you suddenly start needing much more control. I'm not even convinced that will work. But that's going to be a huge debate. I mean, that's going to push fear buttons. Right? I mean, today, largely the powerful are winning these debates. And you know, I worry that these are actually very complicated issues. They require meaningful debate, international cooperation, innovative solutions, which doesn't sound like I just described the US government. But we're going to have to do this. I mean, in a lot of ways, the internet is a fortuitous accident, right? You know, it's a combination of lack of commercial interest, government benign neglect, some military requirements for survivability and resilience, and computer engineers with you know, vaguely libertarian leanings doing what made technical sense. I mean, that was kind of the stew of the internet. And that stew's gone. And there are policy battles going on right now over the future of the internet. In legislatures around the world, in international standards bodies, in international organizations. And I'm not sure how this is all going to play out. But I have some, I guess, suggestions for different people. For researchers, I want to see a lot more research into these technologies of social control: surveillance, censorship, propaganda, and use control. And especially for you guys at Google, you're in a unique position to study propaganda. There's very little work being done on recognizing propaganda. And what I want is my internet to come with all propaganda with a little yellow box, kind of like what you do on your search pages. Right? My paid commercial is flagged as such. I would like that to be done automatically. This seems vaguely impossible, but I think we need to start thinking about it. There is some research done around the edges. There's research done in recognizing fake Yelp reviews, recognizing fake Amazon reviews. Right? But you know, there's right now questions whether trending topics on Twitter is being gamed. Right? So you know, when we're losing this transparency, there's a lot of questions about the information we get. But anyway, I think we need research into because those four things are going to become very important. And understanding how they work and how to get around them is going to become very important. We need safe places to anonymously publish. You know, WikiLeaks was great, but now seems no more. I mean, right now, the best thing we have is something called Strongbox, the New Yorker's running. I'm in the process of trying to review that system right now. I think we need a lot more of these all around the world. We do need research into use limitation. I mean, I believe we're going to get legislation on basically copy protection for digital objects because of 3D printers, because of bioprinters, because of software-defined radio. And that's going to really hurt our industry. Because lawmakers are not going to get this right. They're going to do something draconian and it's going to be ugly. So the better we can solve the actual problems, the less we're likely to be handed solutions that won't work and will hurt everything else. To vendors, I want people to remember that a lot of the technologies we build have dual use. That business and military uses are basically the same. So you see Blue Coat used to censor the Syrian internet, or Sophos used to eavesdrop on the internet, or social media enabling surveillance. Right? On the one hand, the FBI is trying to get laws passed to have us put backdoors in our communication systems. On the other hand, we don't want other countries to do the same thing. Right? This is hard. The policy prescriptions, I think, are harder. I think in the near term, we need to keep circumvention legal and keep net neutrality. I think those two things give us some backstop towards the powerful becoming even more powerful. Long term, fundamentally, we have to recognize we can't have it both ways. That if we want privacy, we have to want it everywhere, our country and abroad. If we think surveillance is good, we have to accept it elsewhere. Right? Fundamentally, I want to see power leveled. Right? Because the relationship is real unbalanced. If you think about historical feudalism, you read about it, it eventually evolved into a more balanced government relationship. So you had feudalism, which it started out as this bilateral agreement. Right? We're in a dangerous world. I need you to protect me, so I will pledge my allegiance to you. Turned into something very unbalanced. Right? I'm powerful. I can do whatever I want. I will ignore my agreements. You're powerless. You can't do anything. And that eventually changed with the rise of the nation state. With basically rules that gave the feudal lords responsibilities as well as rights, right, culminating in something like the Magna Carta. And I think we're going to need something like that on the internet, with the current set of powers on the internet, which will be both government and corporate. Some basic understanding that there are rights and responsibilities. There's some more balanced relationship. And whether that's limitations on what vendors can do with our data, or some public scrutiny for the rules by which we are judged by our data. I mean, I expect, no time soon, but eventually these will come. Because I think this is how we get liberty in the internet world. And I think this is actually a very long and difficult battle. I think some of the results will upend your company. But they might not be coming for a decade or more. So that's what I have prepared. I'm happy to take questions. So there are some rules about a microphone that are confusing to me.
You talked about kind of a game between governments on one hand and corporations on the other, using each other's power systems to essentially get at everyone in the middle. How long do you think that game can play out? Is it indefinite? Can it continue for a foreseeable future? Or do you see some sort of tipping point in which some scandal or something will so threaten the middle as to galvanize?
I don't know. I mean, and I think we're very much in uncharted territory here. We're living in a world where it's very hard for the middle to be galvanized for lots of different reasons. I mean, a lot of people have written about this. I have trouble predicting the future because things are changing so fast. I mean, right now it all seems quite dysfunctional, and there's no mechanism for things to change. But of course, that's ridiculous. Right? That things will change. Exactly how, I don't know. And which way they'll change, I don't know. I mean, if the world is, right, the terrorists might have nukes and we're all going to die unless we live under totalitarianism, people are going to accept that. Right? When people are scared, that's what they'll accept. And technology is to the point where that actually might be the world. But there are a lot of other ways this can play. I'm not able to say. I think this is vaguely the topic of my next book. So I hope to explore the different avenues we might move out of this. I haven't even begun to have an idea of which is likely to be correct, and I think I wouldn't trust me when I decided. We're really, you just read science fiction 20 years ago. We're really bad at predicting not technical future, but social future. Everyone can predict, I don't know, the automobile, that would make people drive faster, but no one predicted the suburb. It's always the second order social effects, and that's what this is all about. So I just don't know.
Is this on? You mentioned the convergence of power, convergence of objectives for the corporations and governments, and also sort of the convergence of capabilities, like the ExxonMobil comment. Do you see anything along the lines of the distinction between them vanishing?
I think they largely are vanishing. And this is my main complaint with libertarianism as a philosophy, that it was really, in the mid-1700s it was great because it identified the fact that power imbalance is bad and we need to equalize power, but it kind of got stuck there and didn't notice that power changed. I think there is a lot of blurring, and some of it is the fact that money controls government, and powerful corporations have the money. We have seen blurring at other times in history. Right? When the Dutch East India Company in Africa, and there are different examples where corporations were de facto governments in areas they were operating. This is not as stark, but power is changing, right? Power is less hard power. Power is more soft power. To use Nye's term, that the nature of power is changing such. So yeah, I do think there is a blurring, but it's different than we thought when we worried about this. The nature of social control is very, very different now than it was. Nature of surveillance is very different. And it's going to change again. What is the half-life of these technologies? 10 years? 5? So what's going to happen in 5, 10 years that'll be completely different? And I don't know.
I really liked your feudalism analogy, and I see one potential flaw in it. And I wanted your
good. Flaws are good. I want those.
Thought about it. As I understand it, feudal lords were pretty much monopolists. Like the Russian serfs were bound to the land, and so they didn't get a choice of which lord to be with. Whereas people do, in fact, have a choice when there's 2 or 3 big guys, right?
But they have a choice, but is it really a choice? If all 3 cell phone companies are collecting the same data and giving it to the same government on the same rules, it's not really a choice.
If I can get a lot more customers by having a very clear privacy policy that respects you in a way the other guy doesn't.
It seems not to be true. It seems you have to get more customers by obfuscating your privacy policy. And there are a lot of great psych experiments about this, that if you make privacy salient by showing your privacy policy, people say, wow, that's bad. Facebook is a great example. They make the privacy policy really hard to find because they don't want you to think about it. Because if you don't think about it, you share. And so, this is the problem with many big, that your normal market economics, which involves multiple sellers competing on features, only works if you've got a lot of sellers competing on features. If the 3 companies that do the same thing, what's the difference between Apple and Microsoft in operating systems? Is it really that different where privacy matters? Around the edges, unless the companies choose to compete on those features. I can't fly less secure airlines. We get you through air security quicker. Right? There is no competition in that. Or more secure airlines. We do a background check on everybody. Right? It's a perfectly reasonable feature to compete on, but there isn't any competition. So, especially if some of these deal with government demands, you're just not going to have the competition. And there's a lot of reason to make that go away as much as possible, because these companies want people to share more. So the thing about bound to land is interesting. No, but well, yes and no, right? It's very hard for someone regular to leave Facebook. That's where your party invites come from. That's where your friends are. That's where that's where your social interaction is. You don't go on Facebook. You don't get invited to parties. You never get laid. You have a really sucky college experience, right? So you're not bound, but there's a lot of social push to stay. It's very hard to take your data when you leave. Again, Google is an exception here. Right? Remember the whole battles about cell phone number portability? That was all to bind people to the cell phone companies, right? To raise the cost of switching. You raise the cost of switching, you can do a lot more to your customers or users, right? If the customers can't switch, you can piss them off a whole lot. So yeah, and the other reason I kind of like the surf model is the notion of people doing stuff online, which is the raw material the companies use to make profits. Right? So it's kind of like you're farming for your, and I guess Farmville would be perfect for this, right? But maybe that's too much. The other way the metaphor works, and other people have written about this, is the feudal metaphor, is that a feudal system, everything is owned. There's no commons. And we're seeing this on the internet, that no piece of the internet is a commons. We have, in the United States, we have very particular rules about commons. Free speech rules, association rules, rules about protesting, because you're on a street, you're on a public street. And those rules don't apply in, for example, Zuccotti Park in New York, because that was a privately owned public space. The internet is entirely privately owned public spaces. Right? So Apple is well within its rights to say to an app creator who made an app to show US drone strikes in Pakistan, you can't have your app on my store. Right? Because it is not a free speech, it's not a protest. This is a private space, Apple gets to decide. So this lack of a public sphere in the world where we are all associating is another way the feudal model works. I don't know how to fit it into what I'm doing. I'll probably figure it out sooner or later.
So the feudal model is really appealing at first blush, but another problem with it is that we actually do live in a democracy, at least theoretically, and we do have the power to vote, at least theoretically. The problem seems to me not that there are currently all kinds of tricks like the people who obfuscate their privacy policies win. It's more about the lassitude of those who are being governed by the government they set up or the corporations they choose to do business with. And so ultimately the problem is we aren't looking after our own interests. Yeah, and so that seems what needs to be fixed. And it's not feudalism because we have the opportunity to escape. We're just not taking advantage of it. I do agree with, I agree with that. It's just getting harder and harder. I mean, some of it is the fact that we are just too good at psychological manipulation. I mean, advertising, political speech has just gotten too good that, I don't know how fair the game is. I mean, yes, you are fundamentally right. The question is, does that translate to being right in practice? The United States is particularly hard. I mean, our political system is not designed for a huge spectrum of political ideas. I mean, you go to any other country and you just realize how narrow our political debate is, just because the way our two-party system is set up. So, but again, unless the parties choose to compete on these features, we don't really have a choice. And some features they do and some they don't. But yeah, I mean, yes, you are inherently right. I mean, sort of, by the book, that's correct. The question is, how does that translate into what we can actually do realistically? So we need to trick Facebook into becoming the EFF.
I'm game.
Does that mean that governments have an incentive to encourage there to be a few small companies so that then they don't compete on things like privacy? If there's only 3, it's much harder for them to compete on something like that.
I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of examples we could look at. I'm going to start poking at some of them. Automobile manufacturers, I mean, they do compete on safety and have for many years. I mean, Saab built an industry on our car is safer than your car. So you do see security features sometimes. In a lot of ways, the organic food movement is a food safety.
Sub is gone.
Yeah, but in the 70s, they were, I mean, that was what they did. Yeah, but the organic food is believed to be more pure. I mean, it's a food purity sale, which is inherently a health sale and a safety sale. You can argue whether it's real or fake, but sort of how the companies are competing. You know, I don't know. I mean, I don't think the government is incenting any particular economic, outcome. I think there's just right now a very happy confluence. Thank you very much.